Welcome to day 29 of the Money Challenge. We're continuing our journey through faith today. Our verse today is the same as yesterday, but I'll read it again because it's got some really important truths in it. His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of Him who has called us by His own glory and goodness. Through these, He has given us His very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. Now, yesterday we looked at the first part of this passage and concluded, firstly, that God has given you everything you need for a godly life, a life full of freedom and abundance. Secondly, the way in which we access this abundance is through the knowledge of God and His kingdom. Now, I want to look though today at the second sentence in this verse. And he says that through them, His very great precious promises, we may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption of this world. It's exciting to think we can escape the corruption of this world. Now, what is the corruption of this world? Well, the corruption of this world occurred when Adam sinned. God's perfect creation became subject to sickness, poverty, and a curse on the very ground of the earth. Yet the promise is that we get to escape the corruption of poverty and sickness through the power of Jesus' death and resurrection. In giving us everything, the curse of poverty and lack is broken over our lives. If we live in the reality of everything, the corruption of the world can't touch us. If we live in the light of this truth, we will live differently from the world. This corrupt world is built on the essential idea that there are limited resources, and I need to make sure that I get my fair share and maybe more of them. Now, God is saying that as believers, we're not subject to limited resources. If I go to a restaurant buffet, I'm not jealous of the large gentleman in front of me who's loaded his plate to the brim. Why? Because I know the restaurant will replace the food that he has taken, and I can have as much as I want. His consumption will not rob me of my share of food. And this is the attitude that God is wanting to instill into believers. If we're entitled to everything, there shouldn't be any petty jealousies or desire to be in someone else's shoes. Well, in order to escape the corruption of the world, we must do something. We must participate. To be precise, we must participate in His divine nature. What does this mean? Well, we all have a human nature. This is the way that natural human people think and do things. We eat, we drink, we sleep in a very similar way. We react as humans in very similar ways. This is the human nature, doing what humans do. Divine nature, by contrast, is doing things the way God does them. In order to escape the corruption, the limiting impact of this world, we need to do things the way that God does them and not the way that humans do them. We participate in the divine nature through His precious promises. What this verse is saying is that in order to act like God, we need to use and make the most of His precious promises. So how do we do this? Well, Romans 4:17 is referring to Abraham, and it reads, "As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations." He is our father in the sight of God, in whom he believed. The God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. I'll say it again. And calls into being things that were not. It is God's nature to call things into being that were not. So when we get a promise, we get to share and participate in the divine nature by calling things that are not as if they were. Every promise you get from God is an opportunity to walk in the divine nature by saying what God has said, what God has promised is true. Even though we're not sitting in the promise or the reality of the promise now, we get to agree with the promise and call the things that are not at the moment as if they were. And this is the way we get access to the everything that God has given us. Look, if I give you a cheque for £1,000, your response to that cheque tells me a lot about your faith. Now, a cheque isn't money. It is the promise of money. For some of you who know me, you may take the cheque and you may already start planning how you're going to spend it. Some of you may even start ordering goods now online, knowing that in 3 days' time that money will clear in your account. But if you don't know me, you might be a lot more cautious about this cheque. You may not be sure whether I can honour a cheque for £1,000. And therefore you don't start acting on it and you say, well, I'll see it when I believe it. For those who know me, they know that the promise of the £1,000 will be honoured. They've formed an image in their heart already of what they're going to do with that £1,000. The image is so real that they'll act on it now, knowing that it will come to fruition. Now, these two aspects, these two different views of a cheque, represent the views that we can have of God's promises. The faith-filled response says, I have a picture in my heart of what the Lord has promised, and I will act now on that promise. The unbelieving heart says, well, I'll believe it when I see it. A sort of a Thomas attitude. If I see the holes in his hands, I'll believe it. In order to participate in the divine nature, we call things that are not as if they were. We completely agree with the promise of God, not just mentally, but our heart is settled and convinced, and we're completely assured by what God has promised. Faith occurs when our hearts and our minds are in complete agreement with heaven, and our hearts are fully persuaded and confident, and we can rest in the promises of God. It's an exciting thing to get to participate in the divine nature. Tomorrow we'll look how we can grow in this area of faith. But I want to pray for today. Father, thank you for your precious promises. Thank you that each promise is an invitation or an opportunity to participate in the divine nature by calling those things that were not as if they are. I declare that I want to live free from the corruption of this world. Amen.